It's the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 25, looking at the players of Euro 2024. This episode is looking at the players of Netherlands. Here we go! Hello and welcome again to the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada. I'm Kevin and we continue Series 25 on the groups and players of the 2024 Euro Cup. This episode covers Netherlands players. This is part 2 of the Players Mediacast, and here we look at the selections. In part 1, we made a list of the candidates and introduced them and their likelihood of making the squad. And there is a link to that in the show notes. This episode will be divided into 2 sections. In section 1, we look over the list we compiled in part 1 to see who made it and who didn't. And in section 2, we summarize surprises in the selections and we review injuries. And Netherlands has a lot of both. So let's get on with it. And we'll just begin by looking at the preliminary information there. The preliminary squad. So Netherlands on May 16th published a 30-man preliminary squad, and on May 30th that was reduced to the 26 players that they're allowed to bring to this cup. But there was a lot of changes during and after that, and we will have to go through those. So sorry, I'll just put the graphic here. 30 players and ultimately 4 players cut, but it's a bit more complex than that, as we will see. Okay, let's move to section 1, the main section of this media cast, and we look at the list that we compiled for part 1 and the candidates on it. And we have Ronald Koeman as the manager, and nothing has changed there, so we'll consider him a starter or a selection for the squad. And we move on to goalkeepers. We had a definite candidate in Bart Verbruggen, and he was selected. A likely candidate in Mark Vlekken, he was also selected. And then 2 possible candidates, Justin Bijlau and Marco Bizot. And Justin Bijlau was selected among those, or between those 2. And we also had a player who made the preliminary squad. It wasn't our possible or even our possible but unlikely candidate. It was down to the one of 3 players seemingly off the squad, Nick Olage. And he was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut. So we highlight him in blue, and we won't give details on him. We'll only focus on those who made the squad. So there we have our 3 goalkeepers, and we move on to defense. And we encounter 2 definite candidates here. The first is Virgil van Dijk, captain of the team, who was selected for the squad, and Nathan Ake also selected, also a definite candidate there. The likely candidate, just one of them, was Lucharel Geertruida, and he was selected for the squad. And we had 4 possible candidates, the first of which was Matthias de Ligt, and he was selected, as was the second, Stefan de Vries. However, the third candidate, Jurien Timber, was not selected, but the 4th possible candidate, Mickey van de Ven, was, making up 6 central defenders there. We had 2 possible but unlikely candidates in Sven Botman. We'll review him in section 2 because injury played a role in that, but we had him as possible but unlikely, as well as Jorel Hato, neither of those making the final squad. On to left backs, and we had no definite candidate, but 2 likely ones. The first was Daley Blind, and he was selected. But the second, Quilindishy Hartman, was not selected, and we knew he wouldn't be because injury had him out until January of next year, and we knew that in part one. So he was likely based on his participation for the squad, but we knew the knee injury was putting him out. We should have moved him to injured there. Okay, and we had two possible candidates, Tyrell Malatia, and he was also injured, so we'll move him to the injury list and not selected. And sorry, we only had one candidate in the possible category. The other was the unlikely Ian Matson. So a bit of an interesting story with him. He was selected for the preliminary squad. He was one of the 4 players cut from it, but then he was recalled to replace Frankie de Jong, who we'll meet soon. He was called to replace him when Frankie de Jong withdrew injured. So actually, Ian Matson is selected for the squad. We'll put him in yellow, which indicates he's kind of a replacement player, but also was a preliminary squad player who initially was cut. Okay, so the complexities begin there in left defence, but we end up with Daley Blind and Ian Matson as our candidate, as our selections. Over to the right side, we had a definite candidate in Denzel Dumfries, and he was selected, and a possible candidate in Jeremy Frimpong, also selected for the final squad. Possible but unlikely Jordan Teze didn't make the even preliminary squad, and we move on. We move on to defensive midfielders. And here we had a definite candidate in Mats Weifer, who was not selected. Again, an injury problem, so we'll move him down to injury list, and we'll talk about the problem more in section 2. And then we mentioned Frankie de Jong, so he was actually selected for the squad, but then withdrew and replaced by Ian Matson, and we'll talk more about his injury at the end. Our possible candidate is exactly the same case. Toon Koopmeiners was selected for the final squad and then withdrew. He was the last one to withdraw, and we'll talk about why later, but he was replaced by Joshua Zirkzee, actually a forward rather than a player at the same position. So that probably opened up the door for Jordi Schouten, although those two did withdraw later on, but perhaps they knew that they were struggling with injury and selected the possible defensive midfielder, Jordi Schouten. So he made the squad. And we also have central midfielders, beginning with the definite candidate, Tijani Reinders, who was selected for the squad. We then had Martin de Roon, selected for the preliminary squad, but actually withdrew from that preliminary squad due to injury himself. So we'll call him a preliminary squad player who didn't make the final cut, but we know that injury played a role in that decision. Or not a decision, he withdrew. Our other likely candidate, though, was Joey Veerman, and he was selected for the final squad. And we move to our possible candidates, Georgino Wijnaldum, who was selected for the squad. The other possible candidate was Quinton Timber, and he was selected for the preliminary squad, but didn't make the final cut. Injuries possibly playing a role there too. We'll cover all that in section 2. So with two players, one player withdrawing through injury and another likely not selected, partly because of injury, we have one of our players who was seemingly off the squad, Ryan Gravenberch, selected for the final squad. So a bit of a surprise there, and we'll tell you in section 2 why we think that's a surprise. We created a category of versatile attacking midfielders, and that category is basically created for Simons, and we had him as a definite candidate. He just plays all over the field, so we thought it was best to place him here. And Javi Simons was selected for the squad. On to left attackers, and the first was just at the likely level, so no definite candidate here. It was Cody Gakpo, and he was selected for the squad. And possible candidate Steven Bergwijn also selected. But the other possible candidate was Noah Lang, and he was not selected. Actually, he's out. Oh no, it's an unknown return date. So possibly his injury playing a role in his non-selection there too. On the right side, we had no definite or likely candidates, just two possible candidates, Calvin Stengs and Steven Berghuis, and neither of them made it even to the preliminary squad. So we'll be interested to see who they put up as the right attacking midfielder, possibly Javi Simons, who we met as a versatile midfielder earlier on. And then for attacking midfielders, we didn't have any candidates, just a player who was retired and not selected for the squad. So here too, we might see Simons or possibly central midfielder Rangers if they use an attacking midfield position. Moving on to forwards, we have two definite candidates, Wout Weghorst, and he was selected, as was the other definite candidate, Donyell Malen. We had a likely candidate with Memphis Depay, who was selected. And then we had three possible but unlikely candidates, but one of them was selected. It was the first one, Brian Brobby, selected unexpectedly, I must say. And the other two were not selected. However, the third one on our list, Joshua Zirkzee, was recalled. Having not even been on the preliminary squad, he was recalled to place defensive midfielder Koop Miners. So we put him in yellow to indicate he was being brought in from the cold, as it were. All right, so those are the selections. There are 26 candidates there. And we review, we move to section 2, a busy section here for Netherlands. In the notable non-selections category, really all of the non-selections were due to injury. So we're going to move that down to the injury section. Meanwhile, a lot of the surprise inclusions also are probably based on injuries. Players being brought in from out of the cold to replace players who withdrew from the squad injured. So the surprise inclusions, well, even for the preliminary squad, goalkeeper Nick Olish was a surprise because there were several candidates ahead of him. He didn't make the final squad, but as I say, even making the preliminary squad was a surprise. Ian Matson, by the way, he was a player who was seemingly off the squad, so that's why it was a surprise to us. I won't go over the recent participation that had us deciding that. Ian Matson, we decided he was a possible but unlikely candidate. And again, we covered the reasons in part 1. And that proved true. He was cut from the preliminary squad, which is to be expected for a possible but unlikely player. But then he was brought back in. But not really a surprise. It was an injury replacement for Ian Matson. We'll put him on the list anyway. Ryan Gravenberch, central midfielder. We had him as seemingly off the squad, having last appeared for the national team in March 2023. but the Liverpool man was selected, and we won't go into detail. We sometimes kind of give the bio of these players, but we have too much to do here, so we're going to skip that. Forward Brian Brobby. We had him as a possible but unlikely candidate, but he was selected. And then Joshua Zirkzee, Zirkzee. Ooh, that hurts. Also a possible but unlikely candidate. In his case, though, he was brought in to replace an injured defensive midfielder. A bit of a strange choice there to replace a midfielder with a forward, but there we have it. New players, though, we don't have any new. All of the players who were selected, or even for the preliminary squad, had been part of our discussion in part one. So we didn't have any new players, which most teams have, one or two, not the Netherlands, though. And now we get to the injury section, so an update on injuries. Firstly, I got to move someone here. Firstly, we have I had a couple of players in the recovered from injury section. Those were players who made the preliminary or the final squad, so they seemed to be recovered, but ultimately withdrew from the tournament. So we don't have any players who were injured that recovered enough to be selected. So let's go through in no particular order the players who are dropped due to injury. We have Martin de Roon, the central midfielder. He had been out with a hamstring. Well, it was called a hamstring muscle injury. Those seem like two separate injuries to me, but that's what the injury tag said. Out with that injury since mid-May and not expected back until July 18th. But nevertheless, he was selected for the preliminary squad, but it seems like the injury did catch up with him, and he withdrew from the preliminary squad before the final squad was even announced. Quinton Timber, also a central midfielder. He was out with a thigh problem since mid-May and expected back on June 11th. He was only a possible candidate for us here, but it looks like his injury caught up with him too, and also played in a role in his being cut from the preliminary squad. We had a Quilindishley Hartman was a left defender who we considered a likely candidate based on his participation, but we knew he would be out. He was out for knee surgery since early April and was not expected back till January 2025. So we knew that, and so did the team. That he was not even put on the preliminary squad. Quilindishley Hartman. Matt Swifer, a defensive midfielder, was a definite candidate for us. He was out with thigh problems since late April. He was expected back on June 17th. That was perhaps a bit hopeful, and it looks like they were aware that he wouldn't make it back because he wasn't named to the preliminary squad like some of the other ones who were close to recovery were. So Matt Swifer out. Frankie de Jong, we saw, was selected not only for the preliminary squad, but for the final squad. He was out with an ankle injury since a recurrence of that injury in late April, and was expected back on June 9th. It looks like he tried to make it, but after being selected for the final squad, it was announced that he was withdrawing due to injury. So we saw that Ian Matson replaced him. Also, Turn Koopmeiners is a bit of a strange situation, actually. This is a very recent injury. He was given special leave to miss the first warm-up match on June 6th. And after that is listed with an abductor injury. So we're trying to figure out where he picked up this injury, because he wasn't injured at the time of the first warm-up match. That was on June 6th. On June 2nd, he had played for his club, but he had finished that match, so that doesn't seem to be where he picked it up. So I'm guessing perhaps he picked it up in his private life somewhere. Sometimes players go skiing, or they fall off ladders, or they slip in their house or something, and I wonder if it's something like that. Anyway, he was withdrawn from the squad after being named to the final squad, and he was replaced, as we saw, by the forward Joshua Zirkzee. So, wow, what a list of players dropped through injury. We also have a few more that were not strong candidates, but nevertheless, injury may have played a role in their non-selection. So we have left back Tyrell Malacia, not selected for the squad. He was out for knee surgery since September 2023. So quite a while ago, and was an unknown return date. So we had him as a possible candidate, perhaps injury playing a role in the decision there for him and all of these players. Sven Botman was out for cruciate ligament surgery since late March and expected back in October. So well known that he wouldn't make the squad. He was a possible but unlikely candidate. Anyway, I mean, aside from the injury, Jurrien Timber, he had been absent for the March 2024 games, but he had recovered in time to play the last two games for his club. Last two games of the season for his club. We had him as a possible candidate, but the central defender, Jurrien Timber, was not selected. Finally, Noah Lang, also a possible candidate we had him as, and he was out with the recurrence of a hamstring injury since February and an unknown return date. And Noah Lang, a left winger there. Again, we're not sure how much a role the injury played in his non-selection. But there we have it. Okay, so wow, quite an injury list for Netherlands. Fortunately, they have bench strength enough to absorb some of these. Anyway, we'll see in the cup how well they absorb them, and we hope this look at Netherlands helps you to enjoy watching them in the cup. I'm just going to keep talking until I get my graphics straight, and so I can end on a good note. There we go. Enjoy the cup, everyone. We would like to thank Mike Tripak, Make Sound Music, and Pixabay for the wonderful background music called Dance 90s accompanying this mediacast.